My own family sat around my hospital bed, whispering about my funeral before I had even died. They thought I couldn't hear them. They thought the medication had made me too weak to understand what they were planning. They were wrong about a lot of things that year, but they were most wrong about that. My name is Margaret, and this is the story of how the people who wanted me gone ended up teaching me exactly who I could trust, and exactly what I needed to do about it. I built my life the same way I built everything else, brick by brick, with my own 2 hands, without waiting for anyone to hand me something I hadn't earned. I grew up poor in a small town, the oldest of 5 children, and I learned early that if you wanted something in this world, you had to go out and take it through work, not wishing. I married young, to a good man named Robert, a quiet electrician with calloused hands and a gentle laugh, and together we built a small home renovation business from nothing, just the 2 of us. A used pickup truck, and a stack of business cards I designed myself on a typewriter borrowed from the library. We worked every job ourselves in those early years, side by side, him handling the wiring and structural work, me managing the books, the clients, the endless paperwork that comes with running something from the ground up. Robert passed away when he was 58, a heart attack that took him in his sleep. Peaceful, in a way I try to find comfort in, though the comfort has never come as easily as people promise it will. By then, our small operation had grown into something real, a company with 30 employees, contracts with developers across 3 counties, a reputation for quality that meant we never had to advertise, because the work spoke for itself. I kept running it after Robert died. I could have sold it, could have taken the money and retired to some quiet life of gardening and grandchildren, but the business was part of him, part of us. Part of everything we'd built together, starting with nothing but a used truck and each other. So I kept going, and over the following 15 years, I grew that company into something worth, by the time this story truly begins, just over $4 million. I raised 3 children in that house, in that life built from Robert's steady hands, and my own stubborn will. And it was those 3 children, the ones I had sacrificed everything to raise, who would eventually teach me the hardest lesson of my life. My oldest, Daniel, was ambitious from the time he could walk, the kind of boy who organized neighborhood kids into little enterprises, a lemonade stand that somehow expanded into a lawn mowing operation, with 3 of his friends working under him by the time he was 12. I was proud of that ambition for most of his life, proud of the sharp business mind that reminded me so much of the version of myself who had built a company from a used truck and a stack of homemade business cards. It was only later, much later, that I began to understand the difference between ambition in service of building something and ambition in service of taking something that already existed. My middle child, Patricia, was different, quieter, more careful, someone who watched more than she spoke. She had gone to college for accounting and eventually came to work for the family business, managing our finances with a precision that made me proud in a different way than Daniel's boldness did. I trusted Patricia's steadiness. I trusted it right up until the moment I learned exactly what that steadiness had been quietly building toward, behind the careful, competent face she showed me every day. My youngest, Sarah, was the one who never quite fit the mold of the ambitious family business the rest of us had built our lives around. She became a school teacher instead, choosing a modest salary and a classroom full of second graders over any involvement in the company that had made the rest of us comfortable. For years, I worried about Sarah in the particular way you worry about a child who chooses a different path, worried she'd struggle financially, worried she'd feel excluded from the family's success. I understand now how wrong I was to worry about the wrong child entirely. 3 children, 3 very different hearts. And it would take a diagnosis, a hospital bed, and an overheard conversation to show me exactly which of those hearts I could actually trust with my life, my legacy, and everything Robert and I had spent 40 years building. I was 71 when the headaches started, persistent, unusual, the kind that don't respond to the over-the-counter medication that had always worked before. My doctor, a careful man named Dr. Okafor, who had been treating me for over a decade, ordered scans that I assumed would come back, showing nothing more serious than the ordinary aches of getting older. They did not come back showing nothing. There was a mass, he explained, sitting across from me in his small office, with images of my own brain displayed on a screen between us, using careful, measured language that somehow made the news both clearer and harder to fully absorb at the same time. A tumor, in a location that made surgery complicated, though not impossible. Further tests would be needed to determine whether it was something we could fight aggressively, or something that would, eventually, take the fight out of my hands entirely. I drove myself home from that appointment, some part of my mind operating on pure muscle memory, while another part of me sat somewhere outside my own body, watching the familiar streets pass by, and wondering how something so ordinary as driving home could continue exactly the same on a day when everything else had just changed so completely. I called my 3 children that evening, one by one, and told each of them the same careful version of the news Dr. Okafor had given me. I want to tell you about each of those 3 phone calls in detail, because looking back, I think each one contained, in miniature, everything I would later come to understand about the people my children had become. Daniel's reaction came fast, almost too fast, questions arriving before I had even finished explaining the situation. What's the treatment plan? What's the prognosis? Have you gotten a second opinion yet? Mom, you need to see someone at the University Medical Center, not just your regular doctor. This is too serious for a general practitioner to be handling alone. His concern sounded real in the moment, urgent and sharp, though I would later come to wonder how much of that urgency was about my well-being, and how much was about something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to suspect yet on that first phone call. Patricia's reaction was quieter, more measured, true to the careful nature I had always trusted in her. "Okay," she said, after a long pause. "Okay, what do you need from me? Do you want me to come with you to the next appointment? Do you want me to start looking into the business logistics in case you need to step back from day-to-day operations for a while?" That last question, about business logistics, seemed reasonable in the moment, practical, the kind of forward thinking I had always valued in Patricia's approach to everything. It would take me a long time to understand what business logistics actually meant in the conversations happening between my 2 older children once they hung up the phone with me. Sarah's reaction was different from both of her siblings, and at the time, I remember feeling almost surprised by how different it was. She didn't ask about prognosis or treatment plans or business logistics. She simply cried, openly, unashamedly, on the phone with me, and then said, "I'm coming over right now, Mom. I don't care what else I have planned this week. I'm coming to sit with you." And she did arrive at my door within the hour, still in the cardigan she must have been wearing for her classroom that day, and simply held my hand at my kitchen table for the rest of that evening, not talking much, just present, the way a person is present for someone they love, without needing to manage or organize or plan anything about it. I didn't think much, at the time, about the difference between these 3 reactions. I told myself all 3 of my children loved me, simply in different ways that reflected their different personalities. Daniel's practical urgency, Patricia's organized competence, Sarah's emotional presence. It would take losing almost everything to understand how mistaken that generous interpretation had been. The surgery, when it finally happened 6 weeks later, was more successful than Dr. Okafor had initially dared to hope. The surgeon was able to remove the majority of the tumor, and while I would need extended recovery and ongoing monitoring, the immediate danger had passed. I remember waking up in the recovery room, groggy and disoriented, and feeling a wave of gratitude so overwhelming it brought tears even through the fog of anesthesia. Gratitude, simply to still be alive, to still have time, to still have a chance to see whatever came next in my life, and in the lives of my children and grandchildren. The recovery period that followed was harder than I expected, both physically and in ways I hadn't anticipated. The surgery and subsequent treatment left me weaker than I'd been in decades, dependent on help for tasks I had always managed easily on my own: showering, preparing meals, even walking safely across a room without the risk of losing my balance. I spent nearly 3 months in a rehabilitation facility before I was well enough to return home, and even then, I needed regular help, someone checking on me, managing my medications, making sure I didn't fall. It was during this vulnerable period, weak, medicated, dependent, in a way I had never been dependent on anyone since I was a child myself, that I began to notice things. Small things, at first, easy to dismiss. Documents left on my kitchen table that I didn't remember signing, though Daniel assured me they were simply routine business paperwork requiring my signature during my recovery. Things Patricia had prepared, and he was just helping facilitate since I was too tired to focus on details myself. Conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered a room, Daniel and Patricia exchanging a particular kind of glance, before smoothly changing the subject to something inconsequential. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the medication and the trauma of everything I'd been through were making me suspicious of people who genuinely loved me and were simply trying to manage a difficult situation on my behalf while I recovered. I desperately wanted that explanation to be true. I would soon learn how badly I had wanted to believe a comfortable lie instead of an uncomfortable truth that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, about 4 months after my surgery, during a follow-up hospitalization for a complication that turned out, thankfully, to be minor, an infection that responded well to antibiotics, but required a few days of monitoring just to be safe. I was resting in my hospital bed, and I want to be honest about something here. I had, in the days leading up to this, started quietly reducing some of my pain medication on my own initiative, without telling my doctors, because I didn't like how foggy it made me feel, how disconnected from my own thoughts. This meant that on this particular Tuesday afternoon, I was more alert than my family assumed I would be when Daniel and Patricia arrived for what they thought was a visit to a mother too medicated to fully track the conversation happening just outside her half-open door. I heard my name first, which is what made me start listening more carefully, rather than simply drifting toward sleep the way I might have on a heavier dose of medication. "She's not going to make it through another surgery if this comes back," Patricia was saying, her voice pitched low but clearly audible in the quiet hallway. "The doctor as good as said so last time. We need to have the estate paperwork finalized before anything else happens, not after. If she dies intestate, or if there's any ambiguity in what exists now, it's going to be a nightmare. And Sarah's lawyer boyfriend is exactly the kind of person who could drag that nightmare out for years, if we're not prepared." "Sarah's fine," Daniel replied, an edge of irritation in his voice that I recognized from disagreements throughout his adult life. "Sarah's not the problem. Sarah's never once asked about money. You know that. The problem is if Mom actually recovers fully and starts asking more questions about the business restructuring we've already started. We need her to sign the final transfer documents while she's still—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word, and finally landed on one that I have never fully been able to forget hearing, applied to myself by my own son, "while she's still manageable. Once she's back to her old self, fully alert, fully sharp, she's going to want to go through everything line by line the way she always does, and that complicates things enormously." I lay in that hospital bed, my heart pounding so hard I was genuinely afraid the monitor attached to my chest would give away that I was awake and listening, and absorbed, piece by piece, exactly what my 2 oldest children had been building behind my back during the 4 months I had been fighting simply to survive and recover. Over the following days, still hospitalized, still pretending to be more medicated and disoriented than I actually was, I listened to enough fragments of conversation, some between Daniel and Patricia directly, some overheard on phone calls Daniel took in the hallway thinking I was asleep, to piece together the fuller picture. While I had been fighting for my life in surgery and rehabilitation, Daniel and Patricia had been quietly working with a lawyer I had never met, drafting documents to restructure ownership of the business and, eventually, my broader estate, in ways that would consolidate control primarily between the 2 of them, with Sarah receiving what Daniel referred to, in one particularly cold phone call I overheard, as a fair token amount, enough that she can't reasonably contest anything, but nothing close to an equal third. The paperwork I had been signing during my foggiest, most medicated days in the hospital, the documents Daniel had assured me were routine business matters requiring my signature had, according to what I pieced together, included preliminary authorizations that moved us significantly closer to this restructuring, Authorizations I had signed without truly understanding what I was authorizing, trusting my son's word about what I was looking at, rather than reading the fine print myself, something I would never, in 40 years of running a careful business, have done under any other circumstances. The most chilling part, the part that took the longest for me to fully accept as real, rather than some misunderstanding I was constructing out of medication-addled paranoia, was the conversation I overheard on my 4th day back in the hospital, when Patricia, speaking quietly to someone on the phone I couldn't identify, said the words that finally, completely, shattered any remaining doubt I had been clinging to. The doctor mentioned the recovery could be complicated by additional stress, or by not managing her medications carefully enough at home once she's discharged. We just need to make sure someone competent is helping her manage things once she's back home. Someone who understands how important it is that she stays calm and doesn't overexert herself during this fragile period. I understood, listening to that particular sentence, exactly what kind of help managing her medications my own daughter was quietly arranging for my return home. I want to be careful here, because I never found definitive proof of an active plan to actively harm me. What I found was something perhaps more insidious in its own way, a willingness to let complications occur, to not intervene too urgently if my health took a bad turn under their care, to treat my continued survival as an inconvenient obstacle to a restructuring plan that was already well underway. It was during this same hospitalization, on my 5th day, that Sarah visited alone, without Daniel or Patricia accompanying her, simply showing up after her school day ended, with a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and a container of homemade soup she'd made herself. Knowing the hospital food wasn't something I particularly enjoyed, I made a decision that day that I have never regretted, though it was one of the harder decisions of my life. I told Sarah everything I had overheard, watching her face carefully as I explained it, needing desperately to know whether this daughter, too, had been part of what her siblings were building, or whether she was, as I suspected and deeply hoped, as much in the dark as I had been. Sarah's reaction told me everything I needed to know. She went pale, then flushed with an anger I had rarely seen from my normally gentle youngest child, standing up from her chair beside my bed so abruptly it nearly toppled over. "Mom, I need you to know I had no idea. None of this. I've been so focused on my own life, my classroom, I barely even talked to Daniel and Patricia about the business because I've never wanted to be involved in it, but I swear to you, I had no idea any of this was happening." I believed her immediately and completely, in a way that surprised me with its total absence of doubt, especially given how thoroughly my trust in her siblings had just been shattered. Perhaps it was simply a mother's instinct, finally awake and paying proper attention after months of medicated fog. Perhaps it was the simple fact that Sarah had never once, in all our phone calls and visits since my diagnosis, asked me a single question about money, about the business, about anything other than my health and my comfort, and whether I needed anything. "What do you want to do, Mom?" Sarah asked, sitting back down, taking my hand the way she had that very first evening after my diagnosis. "What can I do to help you?" I didn't have an answer yet, not that day, but I had the beginning of one, and it would take shape over the following weeks, into something none of my other children ever saw coming. I was discharged from the hospital 10 days later, having fully recovered from the infection that had brought me there, and having spent those 10 days doing something I had never expected to spend a hospital stay doing, quietly, carefully planning how to protect myself and my legacy from 2 of my own children. I did not go home to the house Daniel and Patricia expected me to return to, the house where someone competent had apparently already been arranged to help manage my medications. Instead, with Sarah's help and without informing my other 2 children of the change in plans until it was already accomplished, I went to stay at Sarah's small house across town. In the guest room she quickly prepared for me, telling Daniel and Patricia only that I needed quieter surroundings for my continued recovery, a partial truth that bought me the time and safety I needed, without immediately revealing how much I already knew about what they'd been planning. From Sarah's guest room, over the following weeks, I made a series of careful, quiet moves. I contacted a lawyer of my own, not the lawyer Daniel and Patricia had been working with. Someone entirely separate, recommended by an old friend from my early business years, who I trusted completely, and who had no connection whatsoever to my children. Her name was Vanessa Chen, a sharp, no-nonsense estate attorney who listened to my entire story without a hint of the kind of dramatic reaction I might have expected, simply nodding and taking careful notes, the way a person takes notes on a problem they've unfortunately seen before and know exactly how to address. This happens more often than people realize, Vanessa told me during our first meeting, particularly with adult children who have grown accustomed to expecting a certain financial outcome and start to see a parent's illness as a complication to be managed rather than a crisis to be supported through. The good news is that you're still fully competent, still capable of making your own decisions, and the documents you were pressured into signing during your hospitalization can very likely be challenged and unwound, given the circumstances under which they were obtained. The better news is that we have time now to build something far more protective than what existed before, if that's what you want to do. It was exactly what I wanted to do. Over the following 2 months, working closely with Vanessa, I did something I had never expected to do at 71 years old, recovering from brain surgery, in the guest room of my youngest daughter's modest house. I completely restructured my entire estate and business ownership from the ground up, this time entirely on my own terms, with full understanding of every single document I signed. The first thing Vanessa helped me do was formally revoke the preliminary authorizations I had signed during my hospitalization, documenting clearly, with statements from my own treating physicians about my medication levels and cognitive state during that period, that those signatures had been obtained while I was not in a position to fully understand what I was authorizing. This alone, Vanessa explained, would likely be enough to unwind most of what Daniel and Patricia had been quietly building, though we took additional steps to make the protection even more comprehensive. The second thing we did was commission a full, independent audit of the business's financial records over the previous 4 months, the period during which Patricia, in her role managing our finances, had continued operating with full access to accounts and records while I was hospitalized and recovering. What that audit found confirmed suspicions I'd been almost afraid to fully voice even to myself: irregular transfers, consulting fees paid to entities that, upon investigation, appeared to be controlled by Daniel under different names, a pattern of financial decisions that, cumulatively, had already begun quietly shifting value out of the company and toward my 2 oldest children, in ways that had nothing to do with legitimate business operations. The third thing we did, and this was the part that took the longest and required the most careful thought, was construct an entirely new estate plan, one that protected the business I had spent my whole life building, protected my ability to continue living independently and making my own decisions for as long as I was capable of doing so, and reflected, with complete honesty, exactly what I had learned about the character of each of my 3 children during the hardest period of my life. I want to tell you about the day I finally confronted my 2 oldest children directly, because it is a day I have replayed in my memory many times since, and I still find myself somewhat surprised by how calm I managed to remain throughout it, given everything I now understood about what they had tried to do. I asked them to meet me at Vanessa's office, rather than at my home or theirs, a choice that I think, in retrospect, immediately signaled to both of them that something significant had shifted, that this would not be an ordinary family conversation over coffee at my kitchen table. Daniel arrived first, dressed for what I recognized as one of his important business meeting outfits, clearly having prepared himself for some kind of formal discussion, though I don't think he had any idea what direction that discussion was actually about to take. Patricia arrived shortly after, carrying a folder of her own, presumably prepared with whatever explanation she had planned for whatever she assumed this meeting was actually about. I let Vanessa begin, laying out, in careful, precise legal language, exactly what our audit and investigation had uncovered: the irregular transfers, the consulting entities, the preliminary authorization documents signed during a period of documented medical incapacity, the recorded observations from the hospital regarding conversations overheard by hospital staff and, though I did not initially reveal this detail, by me directly. I watched my 2 oldest children's faces as Vanessa spoke, Watched the color drain from Patricia's face first. Watched Daniel's jaw tighten in the particular way it always had since childhood, when he was caught in something and beginning to calculate his way out of it, rather than simply admitting fault. "Mom," Daniel finally said, when Vanessa paused, "this isn't what it looks like. We were just trying to protect the business, protect you, make sure everything was in order in case the worst happened. Everything we did was because we love you, and we were scared of losing you." "I heard you, Daniel," I said, and I watched something in his face shift as he understood, finally, exactly what I meant by those 3 words. "I heard both of you, outside my hospital room, discussing how to make sure I signed documents while I was still manageable. I heard you discussing how complications with my medication once I returned home might make things simpler for your plans. I am not confused about what was happening. I am not the medicated, foggy version of myself you were counting on managing so easily. I am entirely, completely clear about what my 2 oldest children were building while I was fighting for my life. I want to be fair in telling this part of the story, because even in that room, confronted directly with everything we had uncovered, my 2 children's reactions were not identical, and I think the difference between them matters." Patricia broke down almost immediately, tears streaming down her face, a flood of explanation and justification that, even through my hurt and anger, I could tell was at least partially genuine in its regret, even if the underlying actions remained inexcusable. "Mom, I was terrified," she said. "The doctors made it sound so uncertain, so dire, and I panicked, I think, about what would happen to the business, to all of us, if something happened to you without things being in order. I told myself I was being responsible, being the practical one the way I've always tried to be for this family. I didn't let myself think clearly about what I was actually doing to you in the process. I am so ashamed, Mom. I don't know how to make this right, but I want to try." Daniel's reaction was different, harder, in a way that told me something important about the actual distance between his understanding of the situation and any genuine remorse. "Mom, you're overreacting to a conversation you overheard out of context, probably while you were more medicated than you're remembering now. We were trying to be prepared, that's all. Every family should have their affairs in order. You're punishing us for being responsible." I remember looking at my oldest son in that moment, this boy I had raised from infancy, who had once organized his childhood friends into a lawn mowing business at 12 years old, ambition I had been so proud of for so many years, and feeling a grief that was different from the grief I'd felt when Robert died, different from the grief I'd felt receiving my own diagnosis. This was the particular grief of watching someone you love reveal, clearly and undeniably, exactly who they had become, and understanding that no amount of wishing could make that revelation untrue. "Daniel," I said, as calmly as I could manage, "I am not overreacting to context. I am responding entirely appropriately to 2 of my own children planning to consolidate control of my life's work while discussing whether my continued survival was convenient to their plans. I need you to understand that this conversation is not a negotiation. I have already taken the necessary legal steps to protect what your father and I built. What happens next depends entirely on what each of you chooses to do from this point forward." Over the following months, working carefully with Vanessa, I finalized an estate plan that reflected, with complete clarity, everything I had learned about my 3 children during the hardest period of my life. The business itself, the company Robert and I had built from a used pickup truck and a stack of homemade business cards into something worth over $4 million, I restructured into a trust with careful, specific provisions. Sarah, who had shown up with soup and flowers and simple, uncomplicated presents during the worst days of my recovery, who had never once asked about money, who had immediately and completely sided with protecting me the moment she learned what her siblings had been planning, was named primary trustee, along with a significant ownership stake reflecting both her demonstrated character and the reality that she would need resources to properly oversee what she was inheriting responsibility for. Patricia, despite everything, retained a meaningful stake in the business, smaller than what she might have had under the original plan I'd maintained before all of this happened, but not nothing. reflecting both the genuine remorse she had shown and my own recognition that people, even people who have done wrong, are sometimes capable of learning from it if given a structured, careful path to do so. Her stake came with specific provisions, though professional oversight of her role in financial management going forward, a condition she accepted without argument, understanding, I think, exactly why it was necessary. Daniel's situation, I want to be honest, resolved differently, and not in a way I take any particular satisfaction in, despite everything. The consulting entities Vanessa's audit had uncovered, the funds that had already been quietly diverted during my hospitalization, became the subject of a separate legal process entirely, one that Vanessa advised me was necessary, not out of vindictiveness, but out of straightforward financial and legal necessity. Money that had been taken needed to be returned, regardless of the family relationship involved. Daniel's ultimate inheritance was structured to account for and offset what had already been taken, along with a much smaller ongoing role in the business than he had once assumed would eventually be his, a consequence that emerged directly and, I believe, fairly from his own choices and his continued unwillingness, even after being directly confronted, to fully acknowledge what he had done. I won't pretend that finalizing this new estate plan resolved everything neatly, that some dramatic legal document could simply erase the pain of learning what my two oldest children had been willing to do, or discussing doing, while I fought for my own survival. The months that followed were some of the loneliest of my life, in certain ways lonelier even than the months right after Robert died, because that loneliness, at least, had not come wrapped in betrayal by the people who were supposed to love me most. Patricia and I spoke occasionally during this period, careful, measured conversations that felt nothing like the easy relationship we'd once had discussing business logistics and family holidays over dinner. She attended therapy, something she mentioned to me almost shyly during one of these careful phone calls, trying, she said, to understand how she had let fear and practicality override something as fundamental as basic decency toward her own mother. I appreciated the effort, even as I remained cautious about how much I could fully trust the results of that effort, at least for the foreseeable future. Daniel and I barely spoke at all during this period. He remained, by every account I received through the careful channels of extended family who still spoke with both of us, angry about what he characterized as my overreaction, unable or unwilling to fully accept responsibility for what he had actually done and discussed doing. I grieved this distance deeply, in the particular way a mother grieves distance from a child who is still alive but functionally lost to her regardless, a grief with no clear endpoint or resolution, just an ongoing ache that softened slightly with time, but never fully disappeared. Sarah, throughout this period, became something I had never fully expected any of my children to become. Not just my daughter, but genuinely my closest friend and confidant. The person I called first with good news and bad. The person whose steady, uncomplicated presence in my life reminded me, again and again, that not everyone in my family had failed the fundamental test of character, that illness and vulnerability had unexpectedly placed in front of all three of my children at once. It has been just over 2 years now since that day in Vanessa's office, since the day I finally confronted my two oldest children with everything I had learned and everything I had already quietly done to protect myself in response. My health, I'm grateful to report, has remained stable. Regular scans, careful monitoring, but no recurrence of the tumor that started this entire chapter of my life. I've regained most of my physical strength, though I've never quite regained the particular kind of unguarded trust I once extended so freely to my own children. A loss that feels, even now, like its own kind of ongoing grief, separate from the health crisis itself. Sarah has taken on an increasingly active role in overseeing the business, balancing it thoughtfully alongside her continued teaching career, showing a natural aptitude for the responsibility that surprised even her, given how deliberately she had avoided involvement in the family business for most of her adult life. We talk almost every day now. A closeness that emerged directly from crisis, but has become something I treasure independent of the circumstances that created it. Patricia and I have found our way back to something resembling relationship, though it remains, and I suspect will always remain, more cautious and more carefully bounded than what we once had. She has proven, through 2 years of consistent action rather than words alone, that her remorse was genuine, that the fear and poor judgment that drove her choices during my illness were not, in fact, the full and permanent truth of her character. I've slowly extended more trust back to her, incrementally, the way you test weight on ice that might or might not hold you, and so far, it has held. Daniel and I remain largely estranged. He reached out once, about 8 months after our confrontation, in a phone call that began with what sounded like the beginning of an apology but shifted, within minutes, back into justification and complaint about how the whole situation had been handled, about how I had destroyed the family by responding the way I did, rather than simply forgiving what he continued to characterize as an overzealous, but ultimately well-intentioned attempt to plan for the future. I have left the door open, in the sense that I have never formally cut him off, never told him he could not eventually earn his way back to something resembling trust. But I have also stopped waiting for that to happen, stopped holding my breath for a version of accountability he has not yet shown any genuine sign of being ready to offer. I promised you, at the beginning of this story, a final surprise, and I want to tell you about it now, because I think it matters, both for what it reveals about the family I actually have, and for what it might mean for anyone watching this who has faced something similar. About 6 months ago, going through old files with Vanessa as part of an unrelated update to some other estate matters, I discovered something I had genuinely forgotten about in the chaos of everything that had happened since my diagnosis. A life insurance policy Robert had taken out decades earlier, shortly after we started the business. One of those early decisions made by a young couple trying to protect each other against every possible bad outcome, before either of us had any idea how successful the business would eventually become. The policy had a modest payout by today's standards, but it had also, we discovered, accumulated a small additional investment component over the decades that neither of us had ever actively managed or even remembered existed, quietly growing on its own in the background of our lives for over 30 years. I want to be honest, this discovery wasn't dramatic or life-changing in financial terms, a few $100,000, meaningful but not transformative, given everything else already at stake in the estate. But what it represented to me, emotionally, felt significant in a way that had little to do with the dollar amount involved. It felt like a final gift from Robert, discovered at exactly the moment I needed a reminder that not everything in this chapter of my life had been about betrayal and greed, that some of what I had built, and some of what he had built alongside me decades ago, had simply been about quiet, unglamorous care for the people we loved, care that didn't require dramatic gestures or public declarations to be real. I made a decision about that discovered policy that I think surprised even Vanessa, who had grown accustomed, over 2 years of working closely with me, to my careful, protective instincts regarding my remaining assets. I directed the full amount, without condition or provision, entirely to Sarah, not because I don't hope for eventual reconciliation with my other 2 children, not because I don't believe people are capable of growth and repair even after serious failures of character, but because I wanted, somewhere in this complicated, painful story, one purely uncomplicated act of gratitude toward the child who had simply, consistently, shown up for me with nothing but love and soup and an open guest room. If you are watching this because you are facing something similar, an illness, a vulnerability, a moment where you suddenly need to depend on the people around you in ways you never have before, I want you to hear something clearly. That vulnerability will reveal things about the people in your life that ordinary, comfortable circumstances might never have shown you. This can be devastating, as it was for me, discovering exactly what 2 of my 3 children were willing to consider while I fought for my own survival. But it can also, I've come to believe, be strangely clarifying, even valuable, however painful the process of learning it might be. I do not regret uncovering the truth about Daniel and Patricia, painful as that discovery was. I would have regretted far more deeply proceeding blindly, trusting completely, and only learning the truth after it was too late to protect myself, my legacy, and the parts of my family who genuinely deserved that trust and protection. And if you are someone who has found yourself in a moment of fear or uncertainty about a parent's illness, considering choices that prioritize your own financial security over their basic well-being and dignity, I hope this story reaches you too, the way I hope Patricia's genuine, ongoing effort at repair might eventually reach a version of reconciliation that feels earned rather than simply requested. It is not too late, in most cases, to choose differently. To show up the way Sarah showed up, with nothing but presence and care, and no calculation about what that presence might eventually be worth. Robert used to say, back in the early years of our business, that you learn who someone really is, not during the easy times, but during the hard ones, not when things are going well, and generosity costs nothing, but when things are difficult, and every choice reveals something true about a person's actual character. I understood that principle abstractly for most of my life. I understand it now with a clarity that 4 decades of building a successful business together never quite taught me on its own. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought exposing my son's plan, changing my will, and finding my way back to peace with my youngest daughter was the end of this story. I was wrong, because 6 months after I thought this chapter of my life had closed, my son did something I never saw coming. He took me to court. And what came out during that trial shocked even me. If you watched part 1, you know my name is Margaret, and you know what my son Daniel and my daughter Patricia tried to do while I was recovering from brain surgery. This is what happened next. The papers arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who knocked on Sarah's door my address. Still, even 2 years after everything had happened, since I had never quite found my way to feeling safe returning to my old house alone. I remember standing in Sarah's front hallway, reading the header of the document with a growing, sinking dread. Daniel was formally contesting my new will and trust structure, filing a petition claiming I lacked the mental capacity to make sound decisions at the time I restructured my estate. And this was the part that took my breath away, claiming that Sarah had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable, elderly, medically compromised mother in order to secure a disproportionate inheritance for herself. I sat down hard on Sarah's living room couch, the papers shaking slightly in my hands, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel again after everything we'd already been through. Genuine fear. Not fear of losing money. I had more than enough regardless of how any of this resolved, but fear of what a public court battle might do to Sarah, to her reputation, to the peace she had worked so hard to help me rebuild. Vanessa, when I called her that afternoon, was calm in the way she always was, though I could hear something sharper than usual in her voice, as she absorbed what Daniel was attempting. This is a common tactic, she told me, when someone doesn't like the outcome of a legitimate estate planning process. He's betting that the emotional toll of a public fight will pressure you into a settlement rather than actually going through with a trial. My advice is simple. We don't settle. We go through this properly, with all the documentation we already have, and we let the truth speak for itself. I agreed, though I won't pretend I wasn't terrified of what going through this properly would actually mean for the months ahead. I worried, more than anything, about how this lawsuit would affect Sarah, my daughter, who had asked for nothing, who had simply shown up with soup and presents during the hardest months of my life, now facing a public legal accusation of manipulating her own sick mother for personal financial gain. I found her that evening sitting at her kitchen table, the same lawsuit papers spread out in front of her Daniel had, of course, named her directly as a respondent, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began 2 years earlier, I saw something in my youngest daughter's face that looked less like patient love and more like real anger. "He's using the fact that I love you as a weapon against me," she said quietly, not looking up from the papers. "He's taking the one thing I've never once used for my own benefit, showing up for you, caring about you, and turning it into an accusation. I don't care about the money, Mom. I never have. But I care about him standing in a courtroom and telling people I manipulated a sick woman. That's not who I am, and I won't let him make that the story people believe." I reached across the table and took her hand, the same way she had taken mine on so many difficult days over the previous 2 years. Then we make sure the truth is what people believe, I told her. All of it, even the parts that are hard to hear. Over the following weeks, Vanessa and her team worked meticulously to build our response to Daniel's petition, gathering everything that would demonstrate both my full mental competency at the time of the will's creation and the complete absence of any undue influence from Sarah. This included, at Vanessa's careful insistence, a full neuropsychological evaluation hours of cognitive testing with an independent specialist who had no prior relationship with our family, establishing clearly and professionally that I was, in fact, fully competent, sharp, and entirely capable of understanding and directing my own complex financial and legal decisions. It included statements from Dr. Okafor and other treating physicians, carefully documenting the actual timeline of my medication and cognitive state, showing clearly that the period during which Daniel and Patricia had obtained my signatures on their original documents was, in fact, the period of genuine impairment, while the period during which I worked with Vanessa to build my new estate plan came significantly later, well after my medication had been adjusted and my cognitive clarity had fully returned. It included, too, something I hadn't expected Vanessa to pursue, but that ultimately became one of the most important pieces of our case: a formal forensic accounting review of the consulting entities linked to Daniel, conducted by an outside firm with no connection to our family's original accountants, tracing the money trail with a thoroughness that went even deeper than our original internal audit had managed. What that forensic review found would become the twist that changed everything about how this entire case, and this entire family story, would ultimately be understood. Vanessa called me into her office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, her expression more serious than I had seen it in the 2 years I'd known her, and laid out what her forensic team had discovered. The consulting entities Daniel had used to divert funds during my hospitalization were not, it turned out, a scheme he had improvised in a moment of panic about my illness, as he had claimed during our original confrontation. The forensic accountants had traced the formation of these entities back nearly 3 years, well before my diagnosis, well before any hint that I might become seriously ill. Daniel had been quietly setting up this financial infrastructure long before there was any medical crisis to use as cover for it. More than that, the forensic review uncovered that these entities had also been used, over that same 3-year period, to divert funds from several of the business's actual client contracts, small percentages skimmed here and there from project budgets, dressed up as legitimate consulting or subcontractor fees, money that should have gone toward materials, labor, and profit for the company Robert and I had built, quietly redirected instead into accounts Daniel controlled personally. This wasn't simply a son who had panicked during his mother's illness and made a poor decision about estate planning. This was a pattern of ongoing financial fraud against the company itself, predating my diagnosis by years, that my illness had simply provided a convenient opportunity to accelerate and expand. I sat in Vanessa's office absorbing this, feeling a grief that went even deeper than what I had felt during our original confrontation 2 years earlier, because this meant that what I had originally understood as a single, terrible lapse in judgment during a family crisis was, in fact, something far more calculated, a years-long pattern of dishonesty that my son had been building quietly, patiently, long before he had any excuse of panic or fear to explain it away. The trial began on a cold morning in late autumn, in a courtroom that felt, despite its ordinary municipal architecture, like the setting for the most consequential conversation of my entire life. Daniel sat across the room with his own lawyer, a sharp, expensive-looking man who I later learned Daniel had been paying with funds that, we now understood, likely traced back to the very fraud we were prepared to expose. I want to tell you about testifying in that trial, because it was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Harder in some ways than the surgery itself, harder than the months of recovery, because it required me to sit in a public room and describe, in detail, exactly how my own son had behaved during the most vulnerable period of my life, knowing he was sitting only a few feet away listening to every word. I described the conversation I had overheard outside my hospital room. I described the documents I had signed without understanding, trusting my son's word rather than reading the fine print myself. I described the discovery of the years-long pattern of financial fraud that Vanessa's forensic team had uncovered, fraud that predated my illness entirely and undermined any claim that his actions had been a single, forgivable lapse, born of panic and love. Daniel's lawyer, during cross-examination, tried various approaches to undermine my testimony, suggesting I was confused about the timeline, suggesting Sarah had coached my recollection of events, suggesting my medical history made my memory of that period fundamentally unreliable. I answered each question calmly, directly, drawing on the careful documentation Vanessa had helped me assemble over the previous 2 years, documentation that, piece by piece, made clear that my account of events was not confusion or manipulation, but simply, painfully, the truth. It was on the 4th day of the trial that something happened which none of us, not Vanessa, not Sarah, not even Daniel's own lawyer, judging by his visible shock, had anticipated. My grandson, Daniel's own son, Christopher, 22 years old, and until that point completely uninvolved in any of this family conflict, asked to testify. He had reached out to Vanessa's office directly, on his own initiative, after learning through the family grapevine about the details emerging in the trial, details that apparently connected to something he had witnessed himself and never fully understood the significance of until now. Christopher took the stand, visibly nervous, glancing occasionally at his father across the courtroom before steadying himself and speaking directly to the judge. He described an evening, nearly 3 years earlier, well before my diagnosis, well before any of this crisis had begun, when he had overheard his father on the phone, late at night, discussing what Christopher at the time hadn't understood as anything significant. A conversation about setting up the consulting structure early, before anyone starts asking questions. A conversation that, at 20 years old, Christopher had simply assumed was ordinary adult business talk he didn't fully understand. It was only in recent months, hearing fragments of what had come out during the trial, that Christopher had connected that overheard conversation from 3 years earlier to the pattern of fraud now being formally documented in court. And it was Christopher, more than any of the forensic accountants or medical experts Vanessa had carefully assembled, whose testimony seemed to land most powerfully in that courtroom, not because it was more technically damning, but because it came from Daniel's own son, someone with every reason to want to protect his father, choosing instead to tell the truth. I watched Daniel's face during his son's testimony, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, 2 years earlier, I saw something that looked less like calculated defensiveness and more like genuine, unguarded shame. The trial concluded 11 days after it began, with the judge ultimately ruling comprehensively in our favor, dismissing Daniel's claims of incapacity and undue influence entirely, affirming the validity of my restructured estate plan, and, based on the forensic evidence presented, referring the broader pattern of financial fraud against the business to separate criminal proceedings that would unfold over the following year. I did not feel triumphant hearing that verdict, despite everything. I felt, mostly, exhausted, and beneath the exhaustion, a grief that I suspect will never fully leave me, the grief of a mother who now understood, with complete and undeniable clarity, that her oldest son had been quietly, methodically deceiving and defrauding his own family for years, using a medical crisis not as the origin of his betrayal, but simply as a convenient accelerant for something already well underway. Daniel did not look at me as he left the courtroom that day. I don't know even now whether that was shame or anger or simply the particular kind of coldness that had apparently been growing in him for far longer than any of us had realized. In the months that followed the trial, something unexpected and quietly meaningful emerged from all of this pain. A relationship with my grandson Christopher that had never been particularly close before, given how his father's increasing distance from me over the years had naturally limited our time together. But that grew, following his courageous testimony, into something I have come to treasure deeply. Christopher visited me for the first time, just the two of us, about a month after the trial concluded, sitting at Sarah's kitchen table, the same table where Sarah and I had first read through Daniel's lawsuit together, looking uncertain and younger than his 22 years. "I don't know if what I did was right," he told me. "I keep thinking about whether I betrayed my own father. But I also kept thinking about you, Grandma, and about what actually happened to you, and I couldn't just stay quiet about what I knew. You didn't betray your father, Christopher, I told him, meaning it as fully as I have ever meant anything. Your father betrayed himself, a long time before you ever said a word in that courtroom. What you did was simply refuse to help him hide it. There's a difference, and it's an important one, and I hope you carry that distinction with you for the rest of your life. Christopher has become, over the past year, a regular presence in my life dinners, phone calls, a growing relationship built on the same kind of uncomplicated honesty that Sarah has always offered me. He has chosen, largely, to maintain distance from his father in the aftermath of the trial, a decision I have never pushed him toward but that I understand, having walked a painfully similar road myself. It has been just over a year since the trial concluded, and I want to tell you honestly where things stand with each member of my family, because I think the fullest version of this story includes the parts that remain unresolved, not just the parts that wrapped up neatly. Daniel's criminal proceedings, related to the fraud uncovered against the business, are still ongoing as I record this, moving slowly through a legal process that Vanessa tells me will likely take another year or more to fully resolve. I do not know what the ultimate outcome will be, and I have made peace, as much as I am able, with not controlling that outcome. What I control is my own choice to no longer extend the kind of unguarded trust that made his original deception possible, regardless of how that legal process eventually concludes. Patricia, throughout this second chapter of our family's crisis, chose something that surprised me. She testified during the trial not on Daniel's behalf, but providing additional documentation of the timeline and financial irregularities she had, in her role managing our books, begun to notice even before I confronted her. Details she said she had been too frightened to bring forward on her own, until the broader trial made doing so feel possible. Our relationship, already cautiously rebuilding before this second chapter began, deepened somewhat through this, not because betraying her brother was easy for her, but because choosing honesty, finally and completely, over continued protection of a scheme she had always known was wrong, seemed to represent a kind of accountability I hadn't been sure she was fully capable of after everything that happened during my original hospitalization. Sarah remains exactly what she has been throughout this entire ordeal: steady, honest, present, asking for nothing beyond the relationship itself. The lawsuit that tried to paint her as a manipulator ended, ultimately, in a public legal record, clearly establishing the opposite that she had been, throughout, the one family member acting with complete integrity during the hardest chapter of my life. If part one of this story taught me that illness and vulnerability reveal a family's true character, part two has taught me something perhaps even more important, that the truth, however long it takes to fully surface, has a way of eventually finding its way into the light, often through the most unexpected people: a grandson who could have stayed silent, a daughter who chose honesty over continued protection of her brother, a forensic audit that uncovered far more than any of us initially expected to find. I think often about Robert, about what he would make of everything that has happened since his own passing, about the business we built together, from nothing now caught up in courtrooms and forensic investigations neither of us could have imagined when we were young and hopeful and driving around in a single-used pickup truck. I believe, though I cannot know for certain, that he would be proud of how carefully we ultimately protected what we built, even through a process as painful as this one turned out to be. I want to leave you, at the end of this second chapter, with something I've come to believe deeply: choosing to see clearly, even when what you see is painful, even when it costs you a relationship you once treasured, is always, in the end, better than the comfortable alternative of willful blindness. I could have settled Daniel's lawsuit quietly, avoided the pain of a public trial, protected some version of family peace, built on continued denial of what had actually happened. I am deeply grateful, even now, that I chose otherwise. If this story moved you, if part two gave you the twists you were hoping for, let me know in the comments which moment shocked you most. Was it the forensic audit uncovering years of fraud, or Christopher's testimony? Subscribe to the Betrayal Diaries for more real, heart-touching stories. And let me know if you want a part 3 following Daniel's criminal trial as it concludes. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. I thought part 2 was the end of my son's story. I thought a lawsuit lost, a fraud exposed, and a grandson's brave testimony had closed this chapter for good. I was wrong again. Because what happened during Daniel's criminal trial and what happened after it gave me the final piece of this story I never expected, and honestly, never wanted to need. If you followed along, you know my name is Margaret. You know what my son and daughter tried to do while I was recovering from brain surgery. And you know how the civil trial exposed years of hidden fraud. This is how it finally ended. Nearly 14 months after the civil trial concluded, Daniel's criminal case for fraud finally reached the courtroom. I want to be honest about something. By this point, I had expected to feel a kind of grim satisfaction watching this process unfold, watching consequences finally, fully catch up to years of hidden deception. What I actually felt, sitting in that courtroom gallery again, was mostly a tired, heavy sadness, the particular exhaustion of a mother who has spent nearly 3 years watching her oldest child's choices unravel in increasingly public and painful ways. The prosecution's case built directly on the forensic work Vanessa's team had uncovered during the civil trial, the consulting entities, the diverted client funds, the 3-year pattern predating my illness entirely. The prosecutor, a focused, serious woman named Ms. Alvarez, walked the jury through it methodically, day after day, financial document after financial document, building a picture that was, by this point, painfully familiar to me, but clearly landing with real weight on jurors hearing it for the first time. Daniel did not testify in his own defense. His lawyer's strategy, it seemed, centered on arguing that the funds, while irregularly documented, represented legitimate business decisions Daniel had authority to make in his role within the company, a defense that struck me, watching from the gallery, as considerably weaker than whatever confidence Daniel still seemed to be projecting throughout the proceedings. It was during a recess on the 6th day of the trial that something happened which I still find difficult to fully process, even now. A woman I didn't recognize approached me in the courthouse hallway, introducing herself quietly as Michelle, explaining that she had once worked as a bookkeeper for one of the subcontracting companies that had unknowingly done business with one of Daniel's consulting entities years earlier. "I've been following this case in the local paper," she told me, glancing around as if uncertain whether she should even be having this conversation. "I need to tell you something I never reported at the time, because I was afraid of losing my job. Your son approached my employer directly, years ago, asking us to inflate certain invoices and split the difference with him personally. We refused, and shortly after, my employer lost a contract with your company that we'd had for nearly a decade, seemingly for no reason. I always suspected it was retaliation, but I never had proof, and I was scared to say anything." I sat with Michelle in a small courthouse conference room that afternoon, while she gave a full statement to Miss Alvarez, providing not just additional evidence of the pattern of fraud, but revealing something that hit me even harder than the financial details themselves, that my son had not simply been quietly diverting funds. He had been actively punishing people, years earlier, who refused to participate in his schemes, including, it turned out, costing an honest small business owner a contract, and very nearly their livelihood, simply for declining to help him steal. I want to pause the narrative here and tell you honestly what this revelation did to me, because I think it matters more than the legal proceedings themselves. Up until Michelle's statement, some quiet, stubborn part of me had still been holding on to a particular story about my son, that he was fundamentally a good person who had made a series of increasingly serious bad decisions. Decisions born from ambition, curdling into something darker, but decisions that still, underneath everything, came from the same boy who had once organized his friends into a lawn mowing business at 12 years old. Michelle's statement made it impossible to keep holding on to that story. This wasn't simply poor judgment or ambition gone wrong. This was a man willing to deliberately harm an honest small business owner's livelihood, years before any illness of mine gave him a convenient excuse. simply because that business owner had refused to help him steal. This was not a single lapse. This was character, revealed clearly and repeatedly across years, long before vulnerability or crisis ever entered the picture. I grieved that night in a way I hadn't fully allowed myself to grieve during either of the 2 previous chapters of this ordeal. Not grief for what I had lost, but grief for who my son had apparently always been capable of being, underneath the charming, ambitious exterior I had spent so many years being proud of. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning a verdict. Guilty on all major counts of fraud, with the judge, during sentencing 3 weeks later, taking specific note of the pattern of retaliation against Michelle's former employer as an aggravating factor, one that spoke to premeditation and a willingness to harm others that went beyond simple financial desperation. Daniel was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility, along with a lengthy period of probation and a court-ordered restitution plan requiring him to repay, over time, the funds proven to have been fraudulently diverted from the business. I did not attend the sentencing hearing itself. I had testified. I had sat through the trial. I had done everything the process required of me. And I made a decision, with Vanessa's full support, that hearing my son formally sentenced to prison time was simply more than I needed to witness in person. Sarah attended in my place, not out of any desire to see her brother punished, she told me afterward, but simply so that someone from the family who still cared about him, however complicated that care had become, would be present in the room. About 4 months into his sentence, I received a letter from Daniel, the first direct communication between us since the day of our original confrontation in Vanessa's office, nearly 3 years earlier. I want to share, honestly, what that letter contained, because I think it matters for anyone watching this who has wondered whether people are capable of genuine change even after causing serious harm. The letter did not ask for anything. It did not attempt to justify or minimize what he had done, the way his communications during the civil trial largely had. It was, instead, a long, difficult accounting of his own choices, describing, in detail I hadn't expected, how the initial consulting entities had begun years earlier, not from any single moment of malice, but from a slow accumulation of resentment he had apparently been carrying for years. A belief that he deserved more credit, more control, more ownership of the business than I had ever formally given him. A resentment that had curdled, gradually, into a justification for taking what he felt entitled to, rather than earning it honestly. He wrote about Christopher's testimony, about how it had taken hitting the absolute bottom of losing his son's trust and respect, to finally see clearly what he had actually built his life into. He wrote about Michelle, about the business owner he had cost a decade-long contract, expressing what read, to me, as genuine horror at rediscovering, through the trial, the full scope of harm he had caused to people who had nothing to do with our family at all. I don't expect forgiveness, Mom, the letter ended. I don't think I've earned the right to expect anything from you at this point. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I actually did, to you and to other people, and I am going to spend whatever time I have left trying to become someone who deserves, eventually, even a small amount of the trust I threw away. I sat with that letter for nearly 3 weeks before deciding how, or whether, to respond. I talked it through extensively with Sarah, with Vanessa, and, in a conversation that surprised me with how naturally it happened, with Christopher, who had his own complicated feelings about his father's letter that he shared with me over dinner one evening. I don't think you owe him forgiveness, Grandma, Christopher told me, but I also don't think you owe him permanent, total rejection either, if the letter feels real to you. I think you get to decide what feels right, on your own timeline, without either of those things being forced on you by guilt or by anger. I ultimately wrote back to Daniel not a letter of forgiveness, not yet, and I was careful to make that distinction clear in what I wrote, but an acknowledgement that I had read his words, that I believed at least some of what he'd expressed was genuine, and that I was willing, cautiously and without any promises about what might eventually be possible, to remain open to seeing who he became over the remaining months of his sentence and beyond. Daniel was released after serving 14 months of his 18-month sentence. a reduction earned through good behavior, and participation in a financial ethics program the facility offered. Something he mentioned, almost sheepishly, had initially felt like empty box checking, but had gradually become something he found himself actually engaging with seriously. I did not welcome him back into my life with open arms, and I want to be clear about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes rush toward tidy reconciliation in a way that doesn't reflect how real healing, if it happens at all, actually unfolds. What I offered Daniel, upon his release, was simply the possibility of slowly, carefully demonstrating change over time, the same cautious opportunity I had eventually extended to Patricia after her own genuine period of reflection and consistent, honest action. He found work, modest work, well below what his ambitions had once aimed for, doing project management for a mid-sized contractor who knew his history and hired him anyway, taking a chance that Daniel has, by every account I've received over the past year, worked hard to justify. He pays his court-ordered restitution consistently. He has reached out to Michelle's former employer directly, an act of accountability that I learned about not from Daniel himself but from Sarah, who heard about it through the same local business community that had once whispered about our family's very public legal troubles. Perhaps the most meaningful development of this final chapter has been watching the relationship between Daniel and Christopher slowly, carefully begin to rebuild, on Christopher's own terms and timeline, without pressure from anyone in the family. Christopher told me, about 6 months after his father's release, that he had agreed to have dinner with him for the first time since his courtroom testimony. "I'm not doing this because I think everything is fixed," he told me beforehand, clearly wanting me to understand his reasoning. "I'm doing it because I think everyone, even someone who did what my dad did, deserves the chance to show, over real time, whether they've actually changed. I get to stop giving him that chance anytime I want to, but I also get to give him the opportunity to try, without that meaning I'm pretending the past didn't happen." I found something quietly profound in my grandson's approach to all of this, a clarity and groundedness about accountability and forgiveness that felt, in some ways, wiser than anything I had managed to fully articulate for myself across 3 years of navigating this same painful territory. The company Robert and I built from a single used pickup truck continues to thrive under Sarah's careful stewardship, now with Christopher, following the completion of his business degree, working alongside her in a junior role, learning the operation from the ground up, the same patient way I once learned it myself, decades ago, alongside Robert. Patricia remains involved as well, her role smaller and more carefully bounded than what she once held, but genuine and by every measure I can observe, honest. The 3 of them, Sarah, Christopher, and Patricia, have built something together over the past year that feels, in its own quiet way, like a genuine continuation of what Robert and I originally started. People who show up consistently, honestly, without hidden agendas, doing the steady work of building something real, rather than looking for shortcuts to take what they haven't earned. Daniel has no formal role in the business, a boundary I established clearly as part of his sentencing, and one I have no current plans to reconsider, regardless of how his personal rehabilitation continues to unfold. Some doors, once closed this significantly, I have decided, simply stay closed not out of ongoing punishment, but out of the same clear-eyed protection of what Robert and I built that guided every decision I made throughout this entire 3-year ordeal. Looking back now, across all 3 chapters of this story, the original betrayal during my illness, the courtroom battle that exposed years of hidden fraud, and this final chapter of consequences, accountability, and cautious, incomplete healing, I keep returning to something Robert used to say, the same principle I mentioned at the end of part 2, that you learn who someone really is, not during easy times, but during hard ones. What I would add now, having lived through the full arc of this experience, is this: you also learn, during the hardest times, who you yourself are capable of becoming. I learned that I was capable of protecting myself and my legacy with clarity and strength I hadn't fully known I possessed at 71 years old, recovering from brain surgery, discovering my own children's betrayal. I learned that I was capable, eventually, of extending cautious grace without that grace requiring me to pretend the harm had never happened. And I learned, watching Sarah and Christopher navigate their own versions of these same painful lessons, that the people who show up with honesty and consistency, expecting nothing in return, are the ones who ultimately build something lasting, not the ones who try to take shortcuts through deception, no matter how long it takes for that fundamental truth to fully reveal itself. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with Daniel. I don't know whether the man writing thoughtful letters from prison and slowly rebuilding trust with his own son will remain that man permanently, or whether old patterns might eventually resurface under new pressures. What I know is that I am no longer the woman who extended trust blindly, without paying attention to what was actually being shown to me. That woman learned, through more pain than any mother should have to carry, exactly how to see clearly, and I don't think I will ever fully lose that clarity again, whatever comes next. If this 3-part story moved you, let me know in the comments which chapter hit you hardest: the original hospital betrayal, the courtroom twist with Christopher's testimony, or this final chapter of consequences and cautious healing. Subscribe to the Betrayal Diaries for more real, heart-touching stories about the people who hurt us, and the strength it takes to protect yourself, seek the truth, and rebuild afterward. Thank you for staying with me through this whole journey. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.